Happy Founders Day.
Thank you.
So what we're doing this morning is Therese and prayer with icons. So this image is one of the icons that, or one of the images that Brother Mickey McGrath did of Therese, and it's Therese doing the dishes. So that will be our background, and then we'll look at a few more icons at the end of the session. So the context for Therese's life, she was born in 1873 and died in 1897. So she's pretty closer to us than any of the other women that we've talked about. She lived 100 years after the French Revolution, and in the aftermath of the ongoing tension and violence. In really broad strokes, the wealthy and the monarchy, supported by the church, were connected. And those seeking to establish a more democratic republicanism were generally anti-clerical and anti-Catholic, confiscating property and wealth and closing monasteries. The memory of the 16 Carmelites who were beheaded at the very end of the revolution would have been kept and honored by many, especially the Carmelites in Therese's time. So I don't know if you've seen that plays about those 16 Carmelites that all went to the guillotine one after the other. It's just very, very powerful. But just in the Carmel in Therese's time, they would likely have known those. That story would be very fresh. Therese is well known to many. She spent her entire life in the tightly enclosed religious environment of her family and then the Lisieux Carmel. She grew up in a comfortable religious home with her parents and 4 older sisters, all of whom also entered religious life. Her father, Louis, was a watchmaker, and her mother, Zélie, founded a business creating lace, which is interesting. As a young child, Therese was sickly and was sent for a year to a wet nurse because of poor health, and later suffered bouts of melancholy and scruples, which she described as torture. And you wonder if those aren't connected. Being sent away for a year, connected to the depression that she felt. Therese describes her childhood as full of warmth and affection. When she was 4, her mother died of breast cancer, and her family moved to Lisieux at that time. At the age of 14, on Christmas Eve, Therese had a conversion that transformed her life. So she would look back to that moment as the time when her spiritual seeking began, even though she really had been raised in this very religious family. From then on, her sensitive spirit and her powerful energy were turned toward love instead of toward keeping herself happy. So you get a sense earlier than 14, she talks of herself as just sort of focused on what would make her happy. She applied to enter the Carmelite monastery following her 2 older sisters, but was refused because she was too young. This led to appeals to the local bishop, all the way to the Vatican, asking the Pope to intervene. Her father supported her in this quest. So he was supporting her application to Carmel, even though she was so young. In the unabridged life of the soul, she has quite there's a whole section about that trip to Rome and her experience at the Vatican as a young girl of 14. She, at one point, after seeing all of the signs and rules and admonitions, especially for women, she wrote, "It's so easy for women to be excommunicated in this church." Because they could be excommunicated for, not having their shoulders properly covered or any number of other rules. The other thing that happened during that visit was that she was expressly told that she was to, when she had they were in line to be seen, to see the Pope, that she was to kiss the Pope's ring and not say a word. So she disobeyed that, and as soon as she started crying and pouring out her story to the Pope, who listened to her, and actually the Swiss guard had to drag her away from the Pope, but not before the Pope promised that he would pray for her and told her to appeal to her local bishop. So she went back to the local bishop and the superior, but she did feel some consolation with that message from the Pope that he would pray that she for her vocation. She finally received permission, and at 15, she entered the Carmelite convent at Lisieux and took the religious name Sister Therese of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. We don't usually hear the second part of her title, but it's Therese of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. After only 9 years at Carmel, Therese died of tuberculosis on September 30th at the age of 24. 18 months before she died, she experienced another conversion, a period of doubt and suffering that tested her faith and led to a more mature theological reflection. So she experienced that very dark night. Therese often spoke of her vocation to Carmel, but also as spouse, as mother, as warrior, as priest, as apostle, as doctor, as crusader, as papal guard, and martyr. She did have this very strong desire for martyrdom, especially as a missionary. And this was in the context of there was a whole new missionary activity of evangelization in the church at that time in the 1800s. So, missionaries were being sent out to many different places. And she had a special devotion to pray for missionaries. She said, "My mission to make God loved will begin after my death." She said, "I will spend my heaven doing good on earth. I will let fall a shower of roses." Roses have been a signal, right, of Therese, sort of her signature since her death. In 97, Pope John Paul II declared her a doctor of the church in tribute for the powerful way of her spirituality. And the world came to know Therese through her 3-part autobiography, The Story of a Soul, but she also wrote poetry and prayers and many letters, many letters, 8 plays, and then a journal of her last conversations. Now, those last conversations were actually written by her sister Pauline and others, and some doubt the authenticity of those as being her actual words. In her writing, she described her spirituality as the little way of spiritual childhood, or it's sort of shortened to the little way. What matters in life, she wrote, is not great deeds, but great love. She really taught and lived a spirituality of attending to each person in the present moment and doing everything well and with love. So that's really the kernel of this little way of Saint Therese. It was meeting each person with great dignity and respect and love. And she did this in her community. She did this in her letter writing. She did this in the people that she listened to that would come. But it primarily was internal. And then she wrote about it, and people learned of it later. But that spirituality of the little way that really focuses on the inherent dignity and essential goodness of every other human being and recognizing that in them. That spirituality has been very important in our time and for our time. It's a foundational spirituality for the L'Arche movement, communities with those with developmental disabilities. It's really their foundational spirituality. Also the Catholic worker that really took that little way, the spirituality of the little way of Saint Therese as the foundation of their life and their spirituality, to meet each person coming through the door with dignity and respect and love. She talks about, in her story of the soul, she talks about a sister that was very difficult for her to be with. She was this other sister was very critical and very critical of Therese, and it was very hard for her to be with her. Her practice was to care for her in a special way. So she would go out of her way to be the one to care for this sister. And her goal was that the sister would never know that she was difficult for Therese to care for. And in her autobiography, she talks about this sister finally talked about how much Therese loved her. So she felt that love. So that was her spiritual discipline, really. Her spiritual discipline and spiritual practice was in the heart of her community, being the heart. Being the heart. And leaning toward what was difficult or what she would want to run away from, leaning toward that. It really fits very well with the whole, the Buddhist concepts and the mindfulness practice, that being present in the present moment is really actually very similar to Therese's little way, because only in the present moment can you really meet another person with that level of dignity and respect and love. So to be present to another person, you really need to be present in the moment. I need to be not thinking about the next 5 things I'm gonna do and what time is it and I've gotta go, but really being present. So her spirituality, she called it a little way, and it is a little way. She called it a spiritual childhood, but that her spiritual childhood had an incredible depth and maturity. Not as well known as her theology of suffering, which involves the second part of her title, the Holy Face. So during her time at Carmel, she experienced her father's mental illness, so he became very mentally ill and difficult to care for, and didn't even recognize them. And then his death. She experienced really this darkness, this intense spiritual aridity. She really suffered from the cold and the diet at the convent. They were physically there was a lot of physical suffering for her. And she suffered a painful death from tuberculosis. The way that she faced this suffering was by transforming it into a way of the cross. And the distinctive embodiment of her way of the cross was to focus on the face of Jesus. So the image that is said that when Veronica wiped the face of Jesus and there was an image, Therese focused on the face of Jesus during the crucifixion. So that was how she dealt with, prayed with, transformed her own suffering. Her theology of cross and meditating on Christ's suffering and love is similar to Bonaventure and Julian of Norwich, who challenged Christians to spend time facing and being faced at the cross. Face the cross and be faced at the cross, or see and be seen. So one quote, you get in the handout, there's a number of quotes, but one to read. You probably imagine that my life is one long consolation. If only you knew. My only consolation lies in not having any here below. Jesus instructs me in secret, never showing himself, never letting me hear his voice. He does not even make use of books because I do not understand what I read. However, now and then a phrase brings me consolation, like the following one, which came at the end of a meditation spent in dryness. Here is the master I give you to teach you all you have to do. I want you to study the book of life, which contains the science of love. She continues, the science of love, a phrase which echoes softly in my soul. I desire no other science, and like my spouse in the Canticle of Canticles, having given up all the substance of my house for love, I reckon it as nothing. I know it. Love alone can make us pleasing to God, so I desire no other treasure. So similar to Julian, her message comes down to love. It's a very strong love message, but she didn't have many of the consolations that some of the other women, the visions that Mechtilde and Gertrude and Mechtilde of Hackborn had. She didn't have those. She really felt this dry aridity. So that really takes us to that concept of meditating on the face of Christ and seeing and being seen is very similar to prayer with icons. That's really at the heart of prayer with icons. So that's what the prayer with icons is what I wanted to lead us into this morning. Icons are an instrument for the transmission of Christian tradition and faith. So that's the goal of the icon. They are an aid to worship. They are not intended to force an emotional response. That's really interesting because many other forms of art are very evocative emotionally. Icons are not. They're not intended for that emotional response. There's a guard against overfamiliarity. The icon is silent, and it creates an area of silence around it. Icons are not three-dimensional, and they often have multiple light sources. There's light within the image as well as exterior to the image. So the play of light in icons is really key. There's a minimum of detail. Icons are usually unsigned, and they are written in prayer and silence and fasting with an intricate process. Merton explains, when one sees in prayer, what one sees in prayer before an icon is not an external representation of an historical person, but an interior presence in light, which is the glory of the transfigured Christ. So it's not, as we talked about with hagiographies, with these, stories of lives, it's not about historical detail. These are not paintings of historical people, but the icons are really about the internal presence of light and showing the glory of the transfigured person in God, in Christ. So in prayer with icons, there's a number of modern icons, and then there's the traditional icons. So I just wanted to suggest a few, and then I'll leave one up on the screen, and then we'll end in silence. So I wanted you to see this one, Therese doing the dishes by Brother Mickey. This isn't the entire thing, but I didn't want to pay, so I just did the screenshot with the Trinity mark in it. These are available online, and Brother Mickey does beautiful renditions of saints, but he does not say that he's doing icons. What he's doing is art around the saints. To see the face of Christ in every other person is the main icon, and often the goal of an icon, and the heart of Therese's spirituality. And one of the things in nonviolence training that we teach people is, if there's someone that you're really struggling with, imagine them as an infant, as who they are as they are born, as they are at birth, before any experiences, before any concepts or ideas. Just a beautiful child born of God. So just to remember, looking at the faces of other humans is the best way to see the face of Christ. It's part of Therese's spirituality. I love this one. This is a photo, Thomas Merton took photos. And he titled this photo, "The Only Known Photograph of God." The big hook. So for anyone that's ever felt hooked by God, here's the only known photograph, according to Merton. I just love that. Then we have the traditional Trinity icon, which fills your space. I mean, for you to be in the presence of the Trinity icon, which symbols relationship and love, and you put it in your dining room, which I love, it's perfect. So other people might need to hear about the Trinity icon. You live with it, and you live it, and it's beautiful in this space. This is a contemporary icon by Robert Lenz, and it's actually the front cover of the book that Louise picked for the midday prayer, for the table reading at lunch, which have been beautiful stories and really connected so well with this retreat. Jesus the refugee. We have a large one of this that we take to immigration demonstrations. And just to have the presence of this contemporary icon reminding us and reminding others that Jesus was a refugee and that Christ is present in each person. And then we have the Christ Pantocrator, which fits so well with Therese's spirituality and title of the Holy Face. And the big thing with this, with all icons, but especially when you have these with a face, is to see and be seen. Not as an emotional response, but just that vulnerability. The icons can take us to a place of vulnerability and centered groundedness in our prayer that can be helpful. So to spend time with the icon is a spiritual practice that can be helpful. So I will leave you with the icon. We'll leave that up on the screen, and we'll leave in silence when you're ready.